Weathering goes a long way towards making a model look much more realistic. Locomotives on the railroad work really hard, and they don't stay clean and shiny for very long. Weathering helps give your models that well-used look. Hi everybody, I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. This channel covers model railroading, including planning, hints, tips, how-tos, and updates. To stay up to date, click on the subscribe button. You can also click on the bell so you'll get notified when there's new content available. Today, we're actually not going to be talking about weathering. We're going to talk about the action of meteorological conditions in altering the color, texture, composition, or form of exposed objects. Come to think of it, that's just weathering. Objects in the real world that are exposed to the elements show those effects, whether it be dust, grime, rust, or even just fading paint. So replicating this look helps give our models a much more realistic appearance. In this video, we'll be weathering my model of Conrail 1670. Now, there are some who ask how I can ruin a brand new model by weathering it, but I honestly don't think it's ruining it. In fact, I think it's an enhancement, so I try to weather just about everything that goes on the layout to some extent or another. Now, Conrail 1670 is a GP15-1 from Athearn's Genesis line. By the 1970s, first-generation diesel power was getting pretty long in the tooth, and many railroads were rebuilding the 1950s-era GP7s and GP9s. EMD wanted a piece of this action, and so they offered the GP15-1 as an alternative to those railroad rebuild programs. Conrail 1670 is part of an order of 100 GP15-1s that were delivered to Conrail in 1979. Since my layout is set in 1984, this means that on the layout these units were about 5 years old, and believe it or not, based on some of the photos I found, they were already showing some wear. As I've said before, many people are afraid of weathering, but follow along as I give this locomotive some age and you'll see how easy it can be. Let's get started. The first thing that I'm going to do is to use some microscale micro mask to mask the windows. You can use masking tape for this, but when it comes to these small applications it can be kind of, in my opinion, more trouble than it's worth. So what we're going to do is we are going to use a micro brush to put on the micro mask. I'm not sure what it's made of, but it creates once it dries, it creates a mask that is easily peeled off later. So I'm just applying this almost like I would paint. And there are some fine details in here in terms of windshield wipers and so on that I'm trying not to damage, thus the light touch. And I guess that's another reason not to use masking tape, is it's quite possible the masking tape could pull off those details. I'm not going to do the side windows, and I will show you why in a moment. The reason that I'm doing this is I'm going to spray the entire locomotive after I wash it with Dullcote, and I don't want the Dullcote to do anything to fog the windows. It will put a coating on those windows. I'm also going to do the Numberboards here. Just because I don't know what the Dullcote will do to those. Alright, so we'll let that dry. And so you'll notice I didn't do the side windows, and that is because on these Genesis models they actually slide out of the way. So I'm actually just going to move those back so that they're in the open position, and then I won't have to worry about that. I did miss this glass, however. Now we should be good to go. So while that's drying, let's take a look at the source photos that I used. Here's some information on the sites I regularly use in order to find photos. I use 3 sites as my primary sources for locomotive images. The first is Fallen Flags, which can be found at the URL on the screen. This site's maintained by hand and has been around, I'm going to say, forever, at least in terms of internet years. Of the 3 sites I'm going to talk about here, this one tends to have more pictures from earlier eras, so I tend to have more luck here when I'm searching for things for the 80s. You can find locomotive pictures, freight car pictures, and more at this site. The second is locophotos.com, and while the photos here trend toward the more recent, the search page is quite extensive as far as the options it provides. This site is specific to locomotives, but it does have a sister site called, you guessed it, railcarphotos.com, so you can find rolling stock pictures there. The third site is railroadpicturearchives.net, and you can find that at the URL on the screen. This site houses rolling stock and locomotive photos as well, and also has a nice search feature, although it's different from the options available at locophotos.com. These 3 are my go-to sites, and I'll include links in the description for this video. That said, there are literally thousands of other images out there on sites such as Flickr and other photo sites. The challenge is they aren't cataloged like the sites I mentioned here are. If you have other sources for photos, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. So from those sites, I found these photos here. But it's important to be able to see something so that you're able to kind of replicate reality in the way that nature actually weathers things. In this case, I could only find one photo of the 1670 itself, and it's not the clearest of all photos, but it'll do the job. From this one, I can tell that there's grime and dirt down here along the walkway. There's a layer of rust on the trucks on top of the fuel tank. I can also tell that there's some rust over here on the roof and on top of the engineer's window, which is not actually replicated on this particular model. It's flat, but that's okay. I'm not that worried about it. This was taken roughly the time period that I model. You can tell the nice AMC gremlin there gives it the appropriate time frame. I found some clearer pictures of some of the 1670s sister locomotives from the same period. This one's from 1985. This one's a bit clearer, but even in this one, with the locomotive only being 6 years old at this point, you can tell down here that there is rust forming on around the short hood and on that front step there. You get nice detail in this particular photo, even though the color is a little saturated, but in terms of the grime and so on in that one. And you can even see here where I'm guessing here that they did some washing of the engine, and the doors were open on the side, and the stuff flowed out and left marks just on the bottom there. So that's an interesting detail to try and replicate. And on this third one, again, is more detail in terms of the grime pattern that shows up here on the side, as well as the rust that goes up onto the roof and the visor that's there. Interestingly enough, sometimes from photos, it looks like that Conrail's locomotives were rust buckets because there's just a ton of rust on the roofs and so on. What I found out was that that's not necessarily the case, that the brake shoes that Conrail preferred to use had iron in them. And so as they were doing the normal braking, the bits of iron particles would come flying off and fill the air. That would kind of settle down onto the roofs, and then the iron would oxidize, making it look like there was a coating of rust there, but it was really more the brake dust than an actual rusting surface. So either way, that's still something I want to replicate on these, because it's kind of a signature look for Conrail locomotives, even if they're only a couple years old, like in this case. The next step I'm going to take is to give the locomotive a bit of a cleaning. The best way to do this would be to take the shell off and use warm soapy water to wash it off and wash the side frames and so on. But because of all the details that are on here, I didn't want to go to quite that level, so I'm going to use a bit of a shortcut. All I've got here is alcohol, and I'm just going to use a soft brush here to kind of slather that on there, and that should not break up, but dilute any of the oils and such that I may have gotten on there from handling the model. And the nice thing about that is that alcohol does evaporate quite quickly, so this shouldn't take that long to evaporate and be in good shape. So there may still be some oils left on the model when we're done here, but the idea here is that it would dilute them so that it's not going to show an actual fingerprint or something like that. And from here on in, I'll be handling the locomotive with gloves on, at least until after the Dullcote is applied. Now that the alcohol has evaporated, I can start to work on paint and some other things here. I'm going to use a product called Vallejo Texture de Oxo. It's a rust texture. I've used this before on the Penn Central gondola that I weathered up, that I can show some pictures of here, and I really like the effect that it gives. I'm going to use that for this area up here that is quite rusty around the corners, and there's actually some on the lettering here as well, so I'm gonna use that here. I'm going to use a relatively small microbrush for this. I've already given this a good shake. You can see just from looking at this, it's got a bit of a texture to it. It's kind of nice. I'm just going to start off using the stuff from the cap, and there's some rust on the handrail here. Right up in there. Again, it doesn't have to be an exact match. We're just kind of looking for the feel of things there. I'm going to go around the bottom edge here. Do a bit of a dry brush effect on those letters. Although I can't see on the photo because it's one-sided, I'm going to assume that rust problem was on both sides. So we'll dab some on here as well, over in this area. And we'll throw a little bit up here as well. The thing that I found with this product is the more that you layer it in there, the more texture you get. So we're also going to go with the regular old paintbrush here. See if I can get something a little finer for back here. A little bit of just for grins. If you'll recall, on this particular one, this is the one that had the wash down here, so I am going to get some Dullcote gray here. Give this brush a quick wash here. Use a dry brush type technique where I'm going to take most of the paint off of this. And you can't see that, can you? You can see with the dry brushing, only a very small amount of paint goes on there, so you have a lot of control. And if that looks a little heavy, And it might be. That's probably going to get toned down when I put the weathering powders on. So that should give the effect that I'm looking for there. Looking at the photos, all the photos actually, most of the handrails were pretty grimy, pretty rusty. I'm going to go back and hit those a little bit more. I don't know what was on the gloves those guys were wearing, but they wore that paint right off. On all the photos I have, this box up here shows rust on the knuckles there. I just got a piece of rust there, but that's not going to matter much. Hit these a little bit here as well. Okay, so now that I've got the rust effects on, I'm just double checking here with the photos just to kind of make sure that I'm not really missing anything that would have been prototypical. Hit the front and the back as well, just because of the way the photos look here. And now, with that on, I'm going to go ahead and spray the Dullcote. One of the things that was passed on to me about Dullcote is that you get a better spray if you use hot water to warm up the can before you actually use it. So I have got about 10 ounces of water in this paint cup, and we are going to throw that in there and let the Dullcote can warm up for a couple of minutes. Now that that's been warmed up, we will take it over to the spray booth and get going. I'm going to give this a really good coating of Dullcote, and the reason for that is the next step is to use Pan Pastels, and as I've mentioned in previous videos, the Pan Pastels like to have something that gives it a little bit of tooth to stick to, so by giving this a good coverage of Dullcote, we're able to make sure that that happens. Back at the workbench now, we're going to use our Pan Pastels to start to give this some of the dirty look. You can see here that there's the rust color and everything that goes along with this. I'm thinking that this is a pretty good match for that. This color is burnt sienna shade, and so that's what we are going to start with. I won't be using my typical method of using washes that are India ink diluted in alcohol, and the reason for that is that the alcohol reacts with Dullcote and would cause some splotching and things like that. So if I do decide to do any washes, they'll be diluted with water rather than with alcohol, but I don't think we'll necessarily need to do that here. I'm not going to worry about these grates in the back because they're see-through, and so you don't need to worry too much. But these vents up here will need to have a black look about them, and you could use paint. I'm going to try the black Pan Pastels and see how that works instead. And I like that effect, so I think I'm gonna keep that. Work it into those crevices there. Do the same thing on this side. As long as I've got the black out, I am also going to do the area on the top around the exhaust stacks. And we'll probably go pretty heavy here on this, just because it's going to be an area that gets a lot of soot and dirt. And I'm using a deer head brush here so that I can really grind the color into the Pan Pastels, excuse me, the Dullcote that's providing some tooth. So you can see how quickly the Pan Pastels change that effect. Let us move on to the rust color that is here. And that I'm going to put up here. Do both sides. Anyone that's watched previous videos knows that I use my blending brush quite frequently here to blend things around. I'm going to blend some of this in here as well. So the roofs get a nice rusty color to them. Compare that to that photo. I think it's a pretty good representation. The other place that tended to gather a lot of this brake dust was around the fuel tanks. So we're going to go in there and really dust those up, both the tank and the ends. You'll notice I'm still wearing the gloves, and that is because with the hand oils and such, handling the locomotive like I am would probably result in smudging, just because sweat and oil and so on will smudge that color around. And I might be going a bit heavy here, but we can tone that down a little bit with the finger. Do some touching of the trucks as well. With the brake shoes down there, you know, that's going to get some rust in that area as well. So that's the rust color. And now I'm going to do some dirt, grime. If you look at these pictures, you can see that this area here is pretty grimy. That's more likely to be grime than it is the rust. So I'm going to use a slightly different color. This is raw umber, and you can see just from looking, this is the color I used for the rust over here. This is the color I'm going to use to represent the dirt. Interior areas there, I'm going to use a smaller brush so I can get into here. Where I didn't get the rust, where it would most definitely be, is the walkways. So what I'm looking to do basically is, you know, there should be, this unit's been in service for 5 years, which means there shouldn't really be any surface left that is the original blue color. Should be sooty or faded or, you know, whatever. So that's what I'm trying to do here, is to make sure that none of that is coming through. It's still a little black. And again, I may be overdoing it a little bit for a unit this old, but so far I'm liking the way that this is coming out, so I'm not going to worry about it too much. So if we go back and look at the areas that I did with the paint, so there's the rusty areas, and again, whereas it looked fairly coarse before I put the Pan Pastels on, I think it's got a pretty good look about it now. Similarly, where the water or whatever it was came down out of the doors. That seems to have faded down with the dirt and so on that's in there. Got a nice coverage of the rust dust on the tanks and on the roof. Might want to get just a little bit more. Leaves dirt on that hood. It's a little shiny yet. Let's give this a last once over here in terms of the look. I'm pretty happy with that. It is not the almost new looking photo you see here or here, but it's got the, I think it's got the faded look and the rusty look of this photo of the actual 1670. Like I said, the tanks might be a little too rusty underneath, but I can live with that. The last thing I'm going to do is to use some of the Polyus Oily Black to paint the spot where the fill is. And so we'll see once I do the final coat of Dullcote here how that looks. If it's still shiny, I may go back and do another coat of that. So next step is to go back and Dullcote this again, and we'll be back after that. Okay, back at the bench after doing the dull coating, and I don't know if you can tell or not, but the Dullcote did tone down the Pan Pastels, so I am going to go back and just touch up some of these areas that I wanted to be a little bit more noticeably rusty. And then I will not put a second coat on of Dullcote, that is. Just because it'll probably just tone it down again. But I do think it toned down the rest fine. It did also tone down that oil look that I was looking for. So instead of a GP15 that looks new out of the box, or new from the factory, I guess, we have one that looks like it's pulling its weight around the city of Baltimore. Here are some before and after shots of Conrail 1670 to show where we started and where we ended up. Now, the Dullcote did tone down the overall intensity of the Pan Pastels, even more than I've noticed on other weathering projects in the past. But that did make the model look closer to the prototype photos. The beauty of the Pan Pastels is that you can always go back and add more weathering if it's not quite the effect that you wanted. I should mention that I did go back and use some full-strength gloss coat from the bottle to make those diesel fuel spills I mentioned more shiny. Finally, I went and removed the micro mask from the windows. Now, I'll be honest, this didn't go as well as I planned, and I had a lot of trouble getting the mask off the windshield wipers. On a completely unrelated note, if anyone has any tips on how to repair scratches in window material, I'm all ears. Maybe masking tape would have been the way to go after all. For exclusive video of me struggling with the micromask, you can visit my Patreon site. The link is in the description below. You can also check out the links in the description for great Pixel Depot themed shirts and other merchandise. So, that's all for this episode. Do you have any tips for weathering locomotives that could have helped me here? I'd love to hear about them and put them in the comments below. That's also the place for thoughts, suggestions, or questions. If you enjoyed this video and think others would too, click the thumbs up to like it, and please tell your friends. For more on weathering, you can check out this playlist here. You can also check out more content down here. I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll meet me next time in the train room.